Well, we've done a lot of conferences in this very room over the last 5 years, really longer than that. And I have never seen so many people at the end of the day, and I think I know why. We now come to the crux of the day. We spent much of the conference discussing and debating the issues surrounding international religious freedom policy, what it means, whether it's a good idea, whether and if so, how the Western democracies can cooperate in opposing religious persecution and promoting religious freedom. I'm deeply honored to introduce to you the man who heads the American effort to advance international religious freedom, Ambassador at Large David Saperstein. David is the fourth person to hold this vitally important position, which was created by a law that has been mentioned several times today, the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998. The IRFA requires the government of the United States to advance religious freedom as a part of our foreign policy. The ambassador and his office at the State Department are the executive agents of that policy. The buck, as it were, stops there. Now, others are clearly important to this policy, especially the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, which has, I'm happy to say, now been reauthorized by Congress. I don't know if the President has signed the bill, but after a rather contentious debate over the Commission, which, as I say, is vital to this effort, I believe I'm correct that yesterday it was authorized by both houses. The Commission's job is to make policy recommendations to the President, to the Congress, and to the Secretary of State, and as such, as I say, it is very, very important to this effort. But the man I'm going to introduce to you is literally where the buck stops. He's the one who is confirmed by the Senate as the U.S. official charged with carrying out U.S. policy. He's the one who travels the world representing officially the United States of America and its government and its people to defend those persecuted for their religious beliefs and to advance the habits and institutions of religious freedom. Ambassador Saperstein was confirmed by the Senate in December of last year and was sworn in and assumed his duties on January 6th of this year. Prior to becoming ambassador, he served for 40 years as the director of the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, overseeing the national social justice programming for the largest segment of American Jewry. A rabbi and an attorney for 35 years, Ambassador Saperstein taught seminars in First Amendment church-state law and in Jewish law at Georgetown University's Law Center, so he is very much at home here. In 1999, David Saperstein was elected by his peers as the first chair of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, and this is where I had the honor first of meeting him. I quickly came to have a deep respect and affection for this man. He is savvy, he is intelligent, he is persuasive, as you're going to see, and he is courageous. Most important of all, he's a man of his word. I was proud to support him for the position he now serves with such distinction, and I'm honored to call him friend. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the U.S. Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom, the Honorable David Saperstein.
Tom, you know it's mutual. I've had the pleasure of being able to acknowledge that publicly before, and I do so again today. It is rare to find someone who combines relentlessness and grace as well as Tom does, and I deeply appreciate it. I really want to thank you for this invitation. Before I came on, Tom said, let's agree we're going to look for an opportunity to have you really have a chance to speak about the core issues of your work at the center. And this was the forum in which we decided to do it. What a fascinating forum. First of all, what a great mix of people in attendance and on the platform. This is really remarkable. Some of these folks who are gathered here are folks from around the globe that I've had the opportunity to work with over the many years, but we've more intensively now that I hold the position of Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom. And the institutions that are hosting and co-sponsoring this are kind of a who's who in the realm of religious freedom, and that is a great honor for me as well. And certainly the Berkley Center, I'm deeply in your debt for the contribution you've made to this cause, as is true with almost every one of the entities that is co-sponsoring this vital work. Look, the work in front of us, for those of us who care about religious freedom, is daunting. Let me deal with three different rubrics of issues. The first is a little bit about a reflection on the 8 months that I've been working at the State Department in this work, and our interaction with the rest of the State Department. Secondly, the general architecture of the kinds of concerns about religious freedom that we have across the globe. And then finally, I want to talk about the lessons that we can learn from each other in this transatlantic alliance, some of the similarities, some of the differences, whether those differences are good to have or counterproductive to have. So let's go through it together. A lot of these themes have been picked up during a day of fascinating and invaluable conversations. So first, like so many of you in this room, I've spent a good part of my time building partnerships with other nations to advance religious freedom together, as these global challenges require a global response. And thanks to the good work of my Canadian counterpart, Andrew Bennett, we have forged the Intergovernmental Contact Group on Religious Freedom or Belief. That's the kind of executive branch folks who share common concerns, which brings together like-minded nations to devise strategies to promote and protect religious freedom for all, to look for areas of coordination and cooperation, and to develop reinforcing strategies and tactics. This is paralleled the creation of the parliamentarian network that you know about that brings together MPs from across the globe from different political and religious backgrounds. These action-oriented fora represent new opportunities to push this fundamental freedom forward. Both of these vital international undertakings draw from the global community, from the Northern Hemisphere and the Southern Hemisphere, from every populated continent and from countries of diverse religious populations, with full cognizance that their effectiveness is going to depend on getting beyond just the transatlantic alliance that cares so deeply about these issues. Second, allow me to comment about how reassuring the extensive support that I've received from the Secretary and from the Department has been. Many of you were there when I spoke at my confirmation hearing and again at my swearing in on issues. You know the themes that I laid out as being my priorities, and they have greatly been met because of the support that I've had from the State Department. The State Department has significantly increased the staffing of our office, allowing us to expand our ongoing work to devote staff to thematic issues like the relationship of religious freedom and countering CVE, the negative effects of blasphemy and apostasy laws on religious freedom, the intersection of women's equality and religious freedom. Secondly, the Secretary's staff and the so-called seventh floor, kind of where much of the power at the State Department resides, simply could not have been more supportive in assisting our work on matters big and small. They're always accessible, and my presence at the regular, ongoing, most senior staff meetings at the State Department has guaranteed that our concerns, our efforts are integrated into the broader agenda of the State Department. Third, we have greatly strengthened our programmatic work. I mention this because it's an often overlooked part of the of a vital aspect of our work. We think mostly about the policy work that we do in the public education work that we're doing. But through the Human Rights and Democracy Fund and other funding sources at the department increasingly supports an array of programs that directly impact on religious freedom, that first address intolerance, secondly, increase public awareness of religious freedom issues, third, train civil society and government officials on the legal and policy protections for religious freedom, fourth, strengthen the capacity of religious leaders to promote faith-based cooperation across religious and sectarian lines on behalf of religious freedom or on behalf of other causes that we share in common, like social service. Fifth, empower religious minorities to participate in political processes. And sixth, help combat religiously motivated discrimination and violence. I'm going to come back to this because many of the countries that are represented in this room have similar kind of programs. But most people don't know about them. And there's a reason for that. Because most governments don't talk about them. The very act of talking about them, if you think about it, where these programs are often needed most, are some of the areas most dangerous to religious freedom. And the knowledge of what governments do in those countries could be counterproductive to the very people that we are trying to help. So kind of in a catch-22 about this. Nonetheless, I'm going to come back to develop a recommendation when I get to the recommendation part of my remarks in a little while. And this doesn't, by the way, take into account the millions of dollars more on issues like the rule of law and democracy building that benefits all efforts of human rights and religious freedom, which we care about. And above all, I'm extremely proud that the administration supported the appointment of our special advisor for religious minorities in the Near East and South and Central Asia. Special Advisor Knox Thames, the highly respected former Director of Policy and Research at the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, will build on our existing efforts, which are quite extensive, to address the plight of these minorities. I've spoken frequently about what it would take to allow the displaced minority communities to return to their home communities. I'm going to return to that in my remarks, and Knox Thames will focus on coordinating with government-wide efforts in this regard. He and other colleagues at the State Department are continuing to build an extensive network of contacts as part of our ongoing work wherever religious groups face oppression. This is a major part of what we do. Contacts on the ground in countries across the globe, and contacts with their families, their friends, their communities here in the United States as well. And I think it is not a secret to many in this room that our work in this effort was of extraordinary benefit in efforts to assist the minorities in the Middle East from the scourge of ISIL, whether it was the Yazidis from the first days on Mount Sinjar or the Assyrian Christian communities of the Kaba River. I cite both of these in the context of the broader impact of the State Department's work that saved countless numbers of lives, yet knowing full well, as the video alluded to that is circulating today of the killing of the Assyrian Christian captives. They were captured at the very beginning of ISIL's incursion into the area and have been held for ransom ever since, according to the stories. That too many Yazidis, Mandaeans, Christians, others have suffered terribly and continue to suffer terribly day in and day out because of ISIL's actions. Finally, we had the support of the government in integrating our work into the ongoing work of the State Department. This was already started by Sean Casey's remarkable efforts in our office now on religion and global affairs, but in our work on religious freedom now. The interaction of religious freedom with development, the interaction of religious freedom with democracy building, the interaction with conflict resolution, the interaction of religious freedom with counterterrorism and combating violent extremism, all of these are now accepted as a level within the aesthetic and the ongoing work of the State Department in a way That just wasn't true even a couple of years ago. There's been a profound change, a growing openness of this. We see this in other governments across the globe, but there are many governments across the globe that share a concern for religious freedom that don't yet get the connections of religious freedom with many of these other vital priorities that we share. And we should return to that in the discussion. The support of President Obama and Secretary Kerry, the increased staffing at IRFA, the appointment of Knox, the integration of our work with other departments, the ongoing programs that we have, our new international partnership, all these demonstrate the importance the administration places on promoting international religious freedom. Now, we must continue to expand our focus on religious freedom around the world simply for the obvious reasons that too many countries, religious freedom faces daunting, alarming, and growing challenges. In countries where members of religious minorities contributed for so long to their own societies, often decades, centuries, millennia, we have witnessed an unprecedented crisis as peoples are driven out of their historic homelands at an escalating rate. This is an area ripe for transatlantic cooperation. The Intergovernmental Contact Group for Freedom of Religion and Belief, the International Panel of Parliamentarians for on Religious Freedom and Belief are unprecedented and hopeful signs of growing cooperation. However, we must ensure that these groups do not view just meeting as a victory, but look to ways to concretely advance religious freedom of belief for all, wherever it is challenged. These new networks couldn't be more timely as the challenges continue to grow. Through our annual report and our broader work, we give a voice to all those throughout the world seeking to live their lives in accordance with their own conscience or religious beliefs. We strive to put a human face on this incredibly important human rights issue that touches so many lives and remains so central to the identity of peoples across the globe, including the American people here. The obstacles to religious freedom come in several different rubrics, almost all of which were alluded to at one time or another. Let me just mention them. The violence committed by terrorist groups, by non-state actors. This is an alarmingly escalating, vastly escalating phenomenon. What we've seen from ISIL, the devastation to the Yazidi community, the devastation to the historic Christian communities, the devastation to the other minority communities there. They are being driven out. They are being killed and butchered. They're being enslaved and raped. They're being forced into marriages and forced into conversions. When we turn the focus from the Near East to Africa, we see Boko Haram having much the same kind of impact, killing thousands of people in indiscriminate acts of violence, deliberate attacks on Christians and Muslims who oppose its radical ideology. It subjected people of Nigeria, Cameroon, Chad, Niger to unspeakable acts of terror, sexual violence, abductions, human loss, and destruction, including fatal attacks on churches and mosques, often killing worshipers during religious services or immediately afterwards on the way out. It is done with intent. And this is a devastating development that we have seen in these areas here. I should point out also in a second category, the existing laws on blasphemy and apostasy. There is not consensus in this room, in the transatlantic partnership, of exactly how our concerns in these areas ought to be implemented. Blasphemy laws and apostasy laws, which around the world are used to oppress those whose conscientious religious beliefs happen to offend the majority, are frequently used to repress dissent, to harass political opponents, to settle personal vendettas. The United States uniformly opposes such laws, and we believe they are inconsistent with international human rights and fundamental freedoms, and we will continue to call for their repeal in any country in which they remain on the books. We remain concerned therefore, about the continued imprisonment of, for instance, Mauritanian blogger Mohammed Sheikh Ould Mekheter, who was sentenced to death in December of 2014 for apostasy after publishing an article that some deemed critical of the Prophet Muhammad. Even when there are no blasphemy laws explicitly on the books, accusations of blasphemy can still lead to deadly societal violence. In March 2015 in Afghanistan, Farkhunda Malikzada was beaten to death by a mob of men in central Kabul in broad daylight in front of a mosque after they falsely accused her of blasphemy. The existence of these laws in Pakistan and elsewhere in the world helps create a culture of impunity that facilitates such violence, even when the violence is actually the result of individuals seeking to settle personal vendettas. In that context, I know you all remember the brutal killing of a young Christian couple who worked at a brick kiln in Punjab, Pakistan. The culture of impunity can make it nearly impossible to defend blasphemy cases in the courts, as evidenced by the May 2014 killing by unknown gunmen of Rashid Rehman, a prominent human rights attorney who had been repeatedly threatened for defending a blasphemy case but unable to obtain protection from the police. And then we go into the issue of repression of religious freedom in the name of combating terrorism. In a number of countries, facing the challenge of confronting terrorism and violent extremism from groups claiming religious sanction for their actions, have been responded to by cracking down broadly on religious groups and on nonviolent religious activities, imposing broad restrictions on religious life. The government of Russia continues to use vaguely formulated anti-extremism laws to justify arrests, raids on homes, places of worship, the confiscation or banning of religious literature of minority religious groups, including the Christians not affiliated with the Russian Orthodox Church, and on Muslims. In the Ukraine, Russian-occupied authorities in Crimea subjected members of religious minorities to a campaign of systematic discrimination and harassment. In Central Asia, we see governments cracking down on peaceful religious activities under the pretext of fighting religious extremism. In Uzbekistan, the government broadly banned Islamic groups it categorized as extremists without any reference to violent activities, and it detained members of these banned groups. According to family members, some have died while in custody. And recently, of course, in Tajikistan, the largest opposition party, the Muslim Party, has now been banned as well. Uyghur Muslims in China faced increased controls on their peaceful religious expression and practice, including instances of bans on wearing beards and veils, interfering with Ramadan fasting. Tibetan Buddhists, in the name of combating separatism, face government interference in the selection of lamas. Here in monasteries face increased government management as part of such measures. And then we have all the kind of repressive rules and regulations. Across the globe, repressive governments subject their citizens to violence, detention, discrimination, undue monitoring, harassment for simply exercising their faith, being unable or refusing to register with the government, or identifying with a certain religion, or choosing not to believe in a higher deity at all. In North Korea, religious freedom does not exist in practice. The UN Commission on Inquiry report concluded that there was almost a complete denial by the government of the right of freedom of religion. In countries like Saudi Arabia and the Maldives, completely deny any open religious group from practicing their faith openly other than Muslims, or in the Maldives, anyone other than Sunni Muslims from openly practicing their religion. In other countries, enforce rules and regulations that restrict individuals' ability to practice their religion based on age or gender. Tajikistan, which remains the sole country in the world that bans people under the age of 18 from participating in public religious activities, also has restrictions on women as well. And in countries like Vietnam, regulations require religious groups to undergo that onerous and somewhat arbitrary registration process in order to legally operate. Even with such registration, groups must still obtain specific approval from almost all activities: clergy appointments, religious events, building renovations, the establishment of seminaries or religion classes. Absent such approvals, persons undertaking these activities are subject to harassment, arrest, or detention. And in China, only the religious groups belonging to the 5 state-sanctioned patriotic religious associations are permitted to register with the government and legally hold worship services. Authorities have often pressured unaffiliated religious groups to join the patriotic associations or used a variety of means, including detention, to punish members of unregistered religious or spiritual groups, including Falun Gong practitioners. Chinese human rights lawyers hired to defend these vulnerable groups face additional restrictions. And this includes lawyer Zhang Kai, who is under detention in an unknown location and faces charges of endangering national security and disturbing public disorder due to his peaceful advocacy and representation for Christians in Wenzhou province, where the crosses are being taken down in such large numbers, and his representation of other faith groups as well. We have repeatedly called on China to release him and other church leaders and activists detained in this area. Here, Chinese authorities detained Zhang Kai just before he was scheduled to meet with me on my trip last month to China. And finally, societal violence and discrimination. Here in Western Europe, the rise of anti-Semitism, the rise of Islamophobia, targeting of those groups for violent activity. In Burma, some of the nationalist Buddhist networks that have denigrated Muslims, most particularly the Rohingya, as well as Christians and Hindus, calling for national boycotts of Muslim-owned businesses, cautioning Buddhists against interaction with Muslims. All of this continues on. Against this backdrop, then, let me focus on the relationship of the transatlantic partnership and suggest 8 lessons that I would offer up for your consideration, where we can learn from each other. First, structuring religious freedom through law and through government entities dedicated to religious freedom helps ensure that religious freedom will not fall through the cracks. As is true in your country in 1998, when the IRFA law was being considered, there's a great debate whether or not there should be a separate entity. Why wasn't it part of all of the other human rights groups? Why raise it above or differently from other human rights concerns? And the response of people in both parties voted almost unanimously for the legislation was that of all the human rights, religious freedom was the most overlooked. It was overlooked by the human rights offices of most governments, overlooked by human rights organizations, overlooked in human rights courts, overlooked in regional and multilateral bodies. It didn't get the same level of attention. In part, people didn't know quite how to talk about it, what to make of it. But whatever the explanation, it was kind of a stepchild to the broad schema of human rights protections and concerns that governments and non-governmental organizations had. And this seemed to be a kind of affirmative action program that would lift religious freedom up to the level of other core human rights. On that level, we've made significant progress. The fact that the report comes out regularly, I'll return to the report, the fact that this team of people, bright, dedicated people focused on this issue, has made a profound difference. It is no guarantee that at a macro level it will have a determinative impact on the policy of whatever country you are a part of, but it has helped significantly. And I offer that impact for your consideration. And I will point out, and just so it isn't forgotten, that to the extent that we are today as robust as we are, that we have sharpened the focus of our work as effectively as we've done is due in no small measure to the first ambassador for religious freedom, Bob Seipel, and the first director of the IRFA office, the remarkable Tom Farr, who sits by my side here. Secondly, recognizing the importance and highlighting abuses. The report does that, but one of the tools that the Act gave is the CPC mechanism. Currently, there are 9 countries designated as CPCs. We don't look to designate, but rather view the designation as a vital tool to help foster improvements where other diplomatic initiatives have not succeeded. Our religious freedom engagement is multifaceted, and the CPC designation is one arrow in our quiver. Another is the report itself. It shines a light on abuses and has become a credible resource for many in the academic community, religious advocate groups, think tanks, like-minded foreign governments who work on religious freedom. I remember in the first trip, Tom, that Bob Seipel and I took together in the early year of 2000. We visited several European countries and spoke to people there. Foreign minister of one of the countries said to us, we can never produce a report like that, but because you guys put it out, it's just the time of our second report, I believe, so may have been a touch later. They said, we just send out each of these chapters to our staff in the embassies across the globe and say, here's your blueprint of how to use it. And we hear this still over and over again, that these reports are invaluable and often the basis of some of the other efforts done by academics and think tanks as well. Over the last 17 years, we've created a cadre of over 1,000 foreign service officers in embassies across the globe that have had to connect with religious groups who are often oppressed, where otherwise that wasn't there. On that same trip, Bob and I heard from religious groups we talked about we never had anyone to talk to before. But now this person comes to us to find out what they need to know about us for report, and it develops a connection. We have a name and a telephone number to call whenever we're in trouble, and the embassy now has stepped up their engagement and involvement on this. So structuring these things in this way has had a profound impact. Third, investing in professional diplomatic training in religious freedom. Our training is more than just learning on the job. At the FSI, the Foreign Service Institute in Arlington, Virginia, we provide training to U.S. diplomats and other government officials on religious freedom in different aspects of religion and global affairs. I think all of us who are engaged in this work would like to see this training mandatory, and not just for incoming Foreign Service officers, but for the retraining that is given to DCMs, second in command, and to ambassadors when they go out as well. But we are making significant progress with robust classes now. And just recently, just this past month, we launched another major initiative, and that is we're going out across the globe and pulling together in regions around the countries. We just did in South Central Asia and in East Asia, pulling staff from embassies across the globe and doing training right there and talking about common problems that they share together. And now we have a second one that we're doing, and we hope to hit every region of the globe with these regional trainings as well. Fourth, we want to acknowledge the importance of independent oversight that it was embodied in the idea of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, led by that bipartisan panel of 9 expert commissioners who volunteer their time, supported by a superb professional and nonpartisan staff. The independent commission monitors religious freedom globally and provides policy recommendations to both Congress and the administration. At first blush, it might seem that USERF just duplicates my office at State. But in reality, it complements and helps push the issue forward in unique and valuable ways. It can speak freely on issues of the day, singularly focused on freedom of religion, challenging us to do more, to think about how the U.S. government can more effectively advance this agenda. As far as I know, there are no other entities like USERF that exist in the world. But as is the case with our own Congress, with so many members passionately committed to religious freedom, Parliaments in other nations can play a similar role in providing oversight and political momentum on these issues. In the U.S., USERV's consistent work in highlighting abuses, its efforts to build an international coalition of parliamentarians here. I'm pleased that both the House and the Senate now have wisely decided to provide a multi-year reauthorization of USERV. And in whatever form it comes, an ad hoc parliamentarian caucus or an independent entity like USERV, a government-connected entity like USERV, it is really a help in terms of complementing the work we do and keeping the momentum going. Fifth, seek to coordinate programming. I said I'd return to this, especially in multilateral fora, but also in individual countries. I mentioned that we've strengthened our programming efforts on religious freedom. What I've learned through my travel and engagements is that many like-minded countries, both governments and civil society organizations here, which are investing in similar initiatives. It's in our collective interest to coordinate so that we are not duplicating efforts at a minimum and that we are doing our utmost to maximize our effectiveness. On one of my recent trips, the Canadian High Commissioner convened the ambassadors of a number of like-minded countries in his embassy there, who were members of the Intergovernmental Contact Group on Freedom of Religion and Belief. By virtue of all of us being in the same room discussing how we're advancing our religious freedom priorities in that country through not just policy but programmatic activity, we were stunned to learn that we were working on many of the same issues with many of the same local NGOs without even knowing it. Based on that insight, we've agreed that at the multilateral level, the contact group will be making religious freedom programming coordination a key focus of our cooperation on promoting international religious freedom. At the country level, we are requesting our respective missions to regularly touch base with each other, to discuss progress on programming initiatives, and to coordinate. This allows us to sequence our programs in a manner so that our individual efforts are building on each other. In my remarks to the International Parliamentarian Network on Freedom of Religion just before the UNGA meetings in New York last month, I discussed its approach and encouraged parliamentarians to pass legislation to fund international religious freedom programming in every country and to encourage their respective foreign ministries to prioritize freedom of religion and belief worldwide. 6, implementing the consensus resolutions we have on combating intolerance. Now, there's a lot of fascinating debate went on earlier today in these different sessions about to what extent we mean the same thing by religious belief. And Tom and I usually agree on things, but I want to toss on the table a counter way of thinking about this, Tom, on whether or not we really want to have a common agreement, a common covenant. It may well be that we will end up with the lowest common denominator in the effort to try to forge that kind of consensus. I recognize the positive nature, positive consequences of doing it. I just want to point out some cautions and perhaps counterproductive impact. We don't have the same idea. I'm about to talk about differences, stark differences that we have, but we overlap. The vast majority of issues of what it means religious freedom, we agree on. And I can see a very strong argument that says maybe we're better on an ad hoc basis working together through these entities that I'm talking about, as well as the other organized multilateral entities across the globe, to work together where we agree and go separately where we disagree, knowing that each of us will pick up constituencies and address different concerns in a way that we wouldn't do if we limited ourselves only to those parts of the definition of religious freedom on which we agree. So I just wanted to toss that on the table for us to think about and talk about as we go forward from this conference. Now, while we're ramping up our international cooperation and coordination, we have a very specific role to play internationally. The United States is unique in our approach to, we being the U.S. in this case. The United States is unique in our approach to freedom of expression, and freedom of religion. You heard this referred to several times. They go hand in hand, and by design, both are enshrined in the First Amendment of our Constitution. Too often we see countries interpreting international standards in a way that requires freedom of expression to be curtailed, sometimes quite seriously curtailed, to fully protect freedom of religion and belief. Many countries have laws in place restricting freedom of expression beyond the narrow restrictions permitted under U.S. law. On one foot, under the Brandenburg Statute, pretty much you can say whatever you want, so long as it does not provoke imminently violence. That there's not a danger of imminent violence as a result of provocative speech. And in the end, we have come to the determination that the best way to deal with hate speech, or bad speech, however you would define that, is with good speech, and drowning it out with good speech. And that's what many of our interfaith coalitions and civil society groups and government leaders work together to do. Take the Koran burning. One pastor talking about burning the Koran. And thousands of leaders all across America condemning it. Or the neo-Nazi groups that marched in Skokie, Illinois, the highest concentration of Holocaust survivors in the United States, defended by a huge number, dwarfing the number of neo-Nazis marching, of religious leaders and political leaders and civil society leaders who came to reject such speech. We all know countless examples, and we heard about Shoulder to Shoulder earlier today. That's an important example. It's currently dealing with that in terms of Islamophobia in the United States. Here. On the international front, one way the United States has advanced our view on the issue is through the implementation of UN Human Rights Resolution 1618 on combating religious intolerance. Consensus resolution that simultaneously advances freedom of expression and freedom of religion or belief. The Department of State, in response to that, not wanting to just let it sit there, created a program to collaborate with other countries to implement Resolution 1618 by sending experts from across the United States government to discuss practical ways to deal with intolerance while ensuring the right to freedom of expression. We've had notable success with our partners in Bosnia, Greece, Indonesia. We're expanding this work to cover every region in the world. Given the multilateral nature of this effort, this is a specific area ripe for transatlantic cooperation. 7, complement religious freedom advocacy with a holistic understanding of religion and its effect on every area of foreign policy. Already alluded to this when I talked about the integration of our work into the broader agenda of the State Department. Here, I have one other area I want to talk about here, but before I do, let me just give a real example that I know is very much on the hearts and minds of every person in this room. Many of you have heard me talk about the vision that I have of what it will take for the international community and working with the indigenous communities in Iraq and Syria to allow those communities to be restored to their historic homelands, to their historic home communities. It will keep keeping them in place, defeating ISIL first, until then keeping them in place at a level and standard of living in which their children will have decent schools in their own languages. They will have access to health care. Kids finishing school are going to have access to jobs. Third, it's going to require an effective security system that they'll trust. And they'll have some governance control over. And that means they have to have their own militias integrated with the Iraqi and Peshmerga forces into a cohesive whole and some decision-making about the deployment of those forces. Fourth, restorative transitional justice. Many of these people will be going back to communities in which former neighbors, often complicit with ISIL, often bystanders to ISIL's crimes, often taking over the homes or businesses of their former neighbors. That's a very tough road to travel to restore those communities. And it has to be a plan of restorative justice, of reconciliation. Then there has to be an improved role of governance of minority communities in Iraq, which Abadi has committed himself to, is making some progress on, so that these minority communities will have a real say in the future of their country. And finally, there has to be a plan for economic rebuilding. It is impossible for any one country to do that. And it is impossible for Iraq to do that, or Iraq's role is absolutely indispensable. This can be an international undertaking in which different countries can work together to pick up pieces of that and begin to move now. Because if we wait until the day, may it come soon, when ISIL is driven out and there will be an option for people to return to their communities, if we are not prepared for that day, there will be utter chaos that will descend in sectarian violence again. And we have to move now to plan for that. That is something that this transatlantic partnership can focus on. I give this just as an example to put together a number of the themes of which I'm talking. And let me finally just turn to the last issue, which is combating violent extremism. We do have different views on this issue. In the UK, Prime Minister David Cameron launched his initiative to confront and defeat this poison of extremism. Not violent extremism, but extremism. In other words, he wants to prevent extremism from coming about by intervening early on to try and convince people extreme forms of religion that embrace violent extremism are illegitimate forms of religion. We in the United States have focused more on the question of the violent acts. People can hold whatever religious views they want, no matter how fundamentalist they are, so long as they are not using force to impose their religious views on others, abide by the rule of law. Doesn't matter how fundamentalist, how liberal their theology is. Two different ways of dealing with this. Canadian Prime Minister has called for a program similar to what David Cameron has. Maybe one of those areas that, for us, this may in part be driven by the kind of resonance of the aesthetic of separation of church and state. We don't like the government deciding what religion's good religion and what religion is bad religion, and favoring one religion over another. Here, it may be one of those areas in which our work complements each other. We both want the same thing. We don't want the violence, and we don't want extremist views that sanction that violence. But how you approach it, from which end you approach it, there may be different approaches on. And maybe we can find ways to work together, and maybe we're going to decide we're going to complement each other. I would point out as well that the question of how to support moderate religious forces defined not by their theology, but by their rejection of the use of force to impose their religious views on others and their willingness to abide by the rule of law, that challenge is a very difficult one for us, for very often the embrace of the transatlantic community and of its civil society and religious segments of their communities, not just the governments, their embrace of the very religious groups that we want to lift up, is used by extremists to delegitimize their authenticity within the context of their countries and their religious traditions. This is a major challenge for us, and one that we have to work on together, to find ways to empower those entities who reject the use of force to impose their views on their religious views on others, their political views on others, to find ways to help those civil society and religious groups here without our very embrace delegitimizing them. Glad to talk more about that if you want. I think it's one of the central foreign policy challenges that we face. So these are the challenges that we face. These are some of the differences, some of the similarities that we engage with each other on. Here, religious freedom at its core is directly related to freedom of conscience. It is a right of any individual to define their own relationship with the divine or choose not to have such a relationship. It is a right for that individual not just to worship, but also to practice his or her beliefs, to change his or her beliefs, to speak publicly and directly to others about his or her beliefs, to encourage others to share the same beliefs. There is little in life that is more intimate and personal than an individual's right to believe in and relate to the divine as they choose to, including the right to choose not to believe. And that's why we interpret this fundamental human right so broadly, why it matters in so many ways, and why it is such an appropriate topic for this conference. Thank you all. Okay, so.
Let me begin, if I might, David.
Sure, Tom.
Some of these remarkable changes that you have described that have happened very recently in the State Department, the relationship with religious freedom to development, democratization, counterterrorism, programs that you have described. You don't have a crystal ball, and I don't, but I applaud this. My question is, do you think this is sufficiently rooted in what I hope you'll agree is a pretty difficult culture there at Foggy Bottom, that it will survive the next election, I mean, how are we doing on that front?
The next election and the next ambassador? Well, yeah. Here. The
ambassadors. The point is not the administration. The point is the movement of time. You know you're not going to get rid of the political division.
Yeah.
The economic
Yeah. First, I think it's in our interest to strongly work with like-minded people in other countries across the globe to make progress on this very thing in the European Union countries, in other democratic countries, to see that you cannot successfully counter violent extremism, counter terrorism, have a stable democracy, have real conflict resolution. If a country is going to descend into sectarian violence, if one segment of a community is going to be shut out of governance and participation in that community simply because of their religious beliefs or their religious practices, if a religious group is driven underground in order to live out their religious lives, if it gives up on the hope they can work within the system of a country in order to live out their lives, it become fertile field and fertile ground for extremists of all kinds to mobilize and say, you'll never get what you want working within the system. Come with us, we'll change the system. We'll create a different country about it. This seems to be a growingly self-evident understanding, but not yet as widely across the globe as we would hope for. I thought this would be the hardest task I had, to make this push when I came in. I spent a lot of time in my beginning months going around, meeting with everyone on this, only to find out that actually we had progressed quite far on it, that it was ingrained. Now, I can't tell you that, part of it is just the obvious situation in the world. I mean, it's just an obvious point right now. It is the world imposed this view on the system, Tom, here. No one can really look at the global situation without recognizing that this is now something that has to be taken into consideration. But there was an openness of it. Is some of it idiosyncratic, the particular people who happen to be in place now? Yeah, I think in part it is. But they get it and want to see it entrenched into the entities that they run as well. And so we're moving in that direction. Will there be ebbs and flows? I think so. Is this something that will dissipate? I really don't think so. I think for the next generation, this will be kind of a given part of the way we think about the world. I'm actually optimistic on this. Can't say there are other things I'm not a little more pessimistic on, but on this piece, I'm really quite optimistic.